For the News and Observer, I'm Dawn Vaughan, Capitol Bureau Chief and host of Under the Dome. Today I'm joined by my politics team colleague, Jane Winik Sartwell, who covers higher education. We've got a lot to cover, starting with the biggest news in North Carolina this month. That's not about basketball, and that would be Senate Leader Phil Berger lost his primary race to Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page by 23 votes. Everyone who's listening to this, I'm sure, is well aware of that already, but he conceded just not even a week ago, or about a week ago, as you all are listening to this. We're recording it on Monday, March 30th. One thing that Jane has looked at in her work covering higher education is Berger's influence in higher ed. Berger is still here the rest of the year, the rest of his term. He has been around in power for more than 15 years. He's been in the Senate since 2000. His influence is pretty long lasting. I said in one of our videos that we recorded that if you live in North Carolina, Phil Berger has impacted your life. There's just no way for that not to be true. So let's talk about his impact in higher education, which is connected to the people who have worked for him, and not just higher ed, but just across state government. So let's start with really, who do you think would be is the most prominent of a former Berger staffer that still has a lot of influence in state government, higher education?
Yeah. Hi, Dawn. Thank you for having me. I think that's got to be Jim Blaine, former Berger chief of staff from about 2011 to 2018, who is now a Chapel Hill on the Chapel Hill Board of Trustees. And he also has a consulting firm that was involved in the selection of the current president of the UNC system, Peter Hans. He's got a tremendous amount of influence. Then there's Andrew Tripp, who is the UNC system general counsel, also a former Berger chief of staff. So they're kind of everywhere. Another former Berger chief of staff, also the CEO of the Carolina Hurricanes. So
that'd be Brian Fork. I've only covered Berger for about 7 years, which really is nothing compared to his full career. But Fork was he is a different chief of staff now. But Fork was chief of staff in this era when they sound like a law firm, and they are all lawyers, when former Governor Cooper was in office, and then, of course, Senate Leader Berger and former House Speaker Tim Moore. I'd always say Cooper, Berger, Moore, Cooper, Berger, and Moore. So Fork was chief of staff during a lot of that era, and part of these, I remember, a lot of chief of staffs are sort of behind the scenes. House Speaker Dustin Hall's chief of staff is Neil Inman. Neil was also chief of staff to Moore. Fork was involved a lot with a lot of budget negotiations, that sort of thing. He's kind of a very serious person who now works in sports. So that's a big change there. But of course, sports is also serious, not to make light of that. But what, I guess for people that don't really understand the work of the UNC Chapel Hill Board of Trustees and Blaine being on that, what do they really do? What kind of things that you've been here, a month, 2 months now, as far as what you've seen so far of what kind of action actually happens there?
Yeah, it's a lot of, budget talk, what they're going to cut, what they're going to keep, how they're going to respond to outside funding pressure, internal funding pressure. You've got a ton of different committees on fundraising and, policy around who can record classes and all these kinds of things. So they're pretty powerful. I mean, it's, in a sense, they're almost like advisors to the school, but they also have a tremendous amount of power.
One thing with the reason, as the higher ed reporter, you're on our politics team, is because there's so much crossover between politics and higher ed, especially at the legislative level. There have been things that have come up where things that Berger had wanted, things that I guess more during Speaker Moore's tenure, things that Moore wanted, Berger and Moore wanted, and they would talk about policy changes, what they would like to see in the UNC system. And then sometimes you'd see the UNC system go ahead and make those changes before there was any like new law forcing them to do that. So there's some crossover there. I remember when Lee Roberts was interim chancellor, and Berger and Moore were happy with how he handled protests on campus, and then him becoming, the permanent chancellor. So that's kind of a connection there as far as like, people who have worked together and support, their, I guess, professional trajectory in addition to policy.
Right. You have Blaine on the board as a former chief of staff, but if you really were to look at all the just connections, I mean, I think it would be a much longer story. Berger's connected to so many powerful North Carolina Republicans, so it's everywhere.
So let's see who else is on your list here.
Yeah, Amy Oth. She was a deputy chief of staff for Berger, and now works at the treasurer's office, though she was with the UNC system for a while there. Or actually, not the system, just Chapel Hill, the director of state affairs. And then Berger's former legal counsel, Brent Woodcox, he's now the chief of staff for the state auditor, Dave Boliak, whose approach to the job has been making some waves, which I know you've written about a little bit.
Right. Boliak actually looked to a lot of Berger staff for some of his new staff. So, and Boliak's just been in office for, I guess, a little over a year now. And he was on Under the Dome a few weeks ago. So if people want to listen back to my conversation with Dave Boliak, you'd already mentioned Brian Fork. You mentioned Berger's children. So he has Phil Berger Jr. as a state Supreme Court justice. He's probably his name also is Phil Berger, adding a junior. So as far as people being aware of him, his other son, Kevin Berger, is a Rockingham County commissioner, and his daughter, Ashley Berger Snyder, is general counsel at the North Carolina Department of Labor. So his family is all across state government. He's still part of state government for another year.
Yeah, and Berger has a lot of higher ed policies too, and programs that have been pretty successful, like NC Promise that lowers the tuition for certain schools down to $500 a semester, making education more accessible, as well as NC Innovation that connects research happening at Chapel Hill and NC State and other places to the private sector. But I'm curious to hear who you think might be up next, might replace Berger. Who's in the running, and what's the latest on that?
So we have 3 senators, Republican senators, that have already thrown their names in as of Monday afternoon, the 30th. Of course, if you're listening to this on Tuesday, things can always change, but we've got 3 big names so far, which I'm going to tell you after our break. We'll be right back.
Next up, a laughing session from The Laughing Cow. Now, unpeel a wedge of the Laughing Cow light spreadable cheese, a delicious snack with 2 grams of protein and 25 calories per wedge.
You're listening to Under the Dome. I'm Capitol Bureau Chief Dawn Vaughan, here with Jane Winik Sartwell, who covers higher education. Before the break, I'd mentioned that there are 3 names so far in the running to replace Senate Leader Phil Berger. Berger lost his primary race, but this is just the Republican primary. There's still an election in November. Page will be the candidate on the ballot. Berger has the rest of this term to finish. He's told me even before the primary that if he lost, he will finish out his term. The Senate leader position is a little bit different. So basically a Senate leader, we use that lowercase l because the official title is the Senate President Pro Tem, which takes a long time to type out and doesn't really explain it. The Senate President is actually the lieutenant governor, and they preside, but they only vote in the case of a tie. So basically the Senate President Pro Tem is the leader of the Senate because it's the controlling party. And so Berger, if the lieutenant governor is not there, presides, but he also is the most powerful person as far as controlling what actually comes to the floor, really just what any legislation sees the light of day after filing. So it's an important role. You also represent the caucus, so you're not just this single person. You do need the support of the rest of your party. So Senate Republicans can either make this decision in December and choose, and then do the official vote once the session starts in January, or they can have conversations earlier, which is basically what they're doing. So the three people that have already declared, two are a little more establishment. It's Senator Ralph Heiss, who's a Spruce Pine Republican. He represents several mountain counties. He is a top budget writer. That's really what he's been known for as far as my own perspective since I cover the budget. He's been a top budget writer for a while. Of course, he has other priorities too. He's also been kind of a forefront of Helene recovery funding, I feel like. Senator Michael Lee, also a top budget writer, hasn't been in that position as long as Heiss. Lee is also the Senate Majority Leader. So those are already two pretty powerful positions that they have, which means they have some support from the caucus. They definitely have support from Berger and most likely Rules Chair Senator Bill Rabin. The third candidate who confirmed publicly a few days after Senator Todd Johnson, who we got to break that news with his exclusive interview with him this past week. So Senator Johnson is kind of from a different faction within that Senate Republican caucus. And he said he'd bring basically a fresh take on things because he's not part of that Berger inner circle, which was how he described it. Now it all comes down to actually having the votes of your fellow Republicans. And because it's so early, we don't know where things are. Johnson clearly has plenty of support. Michael Lee has plenty of support. Heiss, it would seem, also have support. But do they have the votes? Which is, just obviously that's how everything works there. So we've got a long way to go. And then with session starting in just a matter of weeks on April 21st, so many things that we're watching and we'll talk about in a future podcast, I'm sure, is how is this session going to be different because Berger is on his way out? And how is he going to use his power while he still has it? What goals does he want to accomplish that he hasn't already? And then how do Heiss, Lee, and Johnson factor in? Really, there's just so many unknowns, I really feel like, going into this session. So that's the latest on Berger. And then, of course, Senate versus House, the perennial issue. Want to get back to a little more higher ed before we move on to our picks for Headliner of the Week. We've talked about UNC Chapel Hill trustees. What's going on over at the other major school in the Triangle, NC State?
Sure. So the NC State Faculty Senate has passed a resolution calling for the reinstatement of Jay Edwards, who was formerly the assistant director of the NC State Pride Center, who was suddenly fired after a recording of him was posted by the group Accuracy in Media, where he sort of addresses DEI programs and how he does and does not, see those factoring into his job. His firing has had a big impact on the community, I think, at NC State. It's a weird time over there, and the Faculty Senate doesn't really... I haven't seen them really do so much, kind of high-profile political action like this, so that's kind of interesting. Then the sort of lawsuits around NC State's building, Poe Hall, that is a big debacle about whether or not the PCBs, the chemicals used to construct the building, have resulted in cases of cancer. There's a lot of legislation about that in the air right now. I'm watching that pretty closely.
One other thing I'd mentioned about session coming up is that because of the lack of a state budget last year and this fight over taxes between Berger and Hall, I don't know if there's any daylight there or how that'll change, but of the many different groups whose money comes from the General Assembly, the UNC system, I would think, and all the campuses are paying close attention to what happens next.
Certainly. It's a huge topic of conversation at trustees meetings and basically everywhere on campus. And it affects, funding for Poe Hall as well. So, yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on to our picks for Headliner of the Week. Jane, I'll start with you, and it's kind of the same theme of our higher ed conversation today.
Yeah, I got to go with the basketball coach search at NC State and UNC. It seems like, NC State has made their selection in the Tennessee associate head coach Justin Gainey, which is interesting because they made that decision so quickly, whereas UNC Chapel Hill, after the firing of Hubert Davis, appears to be taking a little bit more time. And I just, it's interesting to see the difference in those approaches. And I wonder how everything will turn out down the line.
Yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of people have thoughts on Hubert Davis, who I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. He's done a lot for North Carolina and UNC Chapel Hill, and wish him the best in whatever turns out for him. I guess he's not going to go coach at NC State now.
I guess not.
So I don't know. Maybe Berger's interested in coaching basketball. So I am going to stick with the higher ed basketball theme because, goodness gracious, March Madness was just so crazy. Listeners know that I went to Virginia Tech, go Hokies and all, but my local primary allegiance has been Duke because I worked in Durham for so long. And really just the Duke men's basketball heartbreaking game against UConn. It was wonderful for UConn, but not for Duke fans. And my headliner is Caden Boozer because he came out and immediately took responsibility about the last play that ended up. UConn took that and won, and he took responsibility and talked about being disappointing other people. But I want to give him the shout out for taking that responsibility because, again, we're talking about sports and politics, and so many people in politics will never admit they did anything wrong. It's okay to admit you make a mistake. Here at the News and Observer, when we make a correction, we tell everybody that we screwed up. Like, there's no hiding from it. You should just acknowledge it. But Boozer really just seemed like he just took it so hard. And he's not the only one on the team. Everyone on Blue Devils blew that big lead they had at the half. So it wasn't just him. So I'm sure he'll, maybe by today feeling better and can look to whatever's next. So
I hope so.
That's right. All right. So we're at a time for the News and Observer. I'm Dawn Vaughan with Jane Sartwell, producer Kevin Keister. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
For more from our politics team, subscribe to the News and Observer at newsobserver.com/subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at Under the Dome and NC Insider, and sign up for our weekly political newsletter, also called Under the Dome, at newsobserver.com/newsletters. Thanks for listening.